Hi, this is your critique for your second project. This will be for Morgan, Jeremy, and Ryan. We'll start here with Morgan's posters. We have, a few variations on Flickr, and your subject is obvious. Guns in school, and then you're the figure with the gun, and there's no students in that space, so it definitely gets across that idea of the teacher with the gun. Um, and I think it's a really good issue to bring up. An interesting part of the issue, this whole dialogue about arming our teachers or some of our teachers, or even allowing them to have guns in school, is interesting. Um, so your composition, I like the composition. I like the classroom certainly as a backdrop works 100%. And overall, I think utilizing this neutral grayscale helps you emphasize the elements that you want to. But I like that they're just subtly emphasized. Um, your the gun, I think, is obviously the most emphasized simply because there's a little bit of color around there, and the shape of it is much more organic. These cutouts are very square. And then, of course, it's interacting with your form. And then that little bit of brown, that saturation shift and color shift of the gun, also further helps emphasize it. It's also in this lower right-hand corner. And the diagonal movement, I like how it flows with the text, or at least some of the text. And then your text, new to the handbook, guns in school. So you have that one, and then you have this one with the warning. And I, I like the transition here because it's funny how that word warning puts more of a negative connotation to it. I have in this one almost sort of a neutral connotation, though neutral to, I would say, leaning slightly negative, simply because that's the cutout words, and that cutout word we kind of associate with like ransom letter or something like that. We see in the movies it's become this sort of symbol for that sort of thing. So I think there's already this kind of negative leaning towards it, but it's the word warning really pushes that much more overtly, where it might be argued one way or the other in the previous composition. And that's kind of what, that's really what we're looking at in this project. I wanted you to create a couple different posters that were very similar, but just tweaking some of the visual nuance or the text that's within them, because posters most often rely on text to help communicate their message. So that's good to play with the words. Now the transition we have here is with the figure in the background, you know, and we still have new to the handbook, guns in schools, and then you have teachers and cop, teacher and cop. So now it seems to me, speaking about that role, which I think is the interesting dialogue of that, a teacher and a cop, those are two very different roles in society and two very different goals. And what is your goal as a teacher is to be a teacher. And then you have to be this enforcer, an armed enforcer. I'm not sure that that creates the healthiest atmosphere for learning. But it certainly doesn't create a healthy atmosphere. Students are concerned about being shot while in school either. So it's really, important and nuanced and dialogue to have here. And this one, you bring back that warning, new to the handbook, guns in schools, teacher and cop, and then you add a little question mark, and that I think goes to what I was talking about just a second ago. Are you a teacher or a cop? Can you be both? Is that a healthy dynamic within a learning setting? So I like how your poster brings up a lot of questions regarding this issue, and I also I kind of like there's not this overt obvious thing that you're pushing on me, and I like that as an artist. I like that. Uh, because it opens up to dialogue, and that's really what's needed to solve a problem like this. Whereas if we, all dig our trenches and get set and not really ready to listen to other perspectives, we're not going to get anywhere in this issue. Unless one group decides to just pummel the other group and literally, bury them in some sense, be it a political or a physical sense. All right, and then looking at your written research, you asked some good questions here. You're talking about obviously social media, and you asked the question: is this the way our democracy is looked at? As always one-upping the things that came before. And you're talking about, according to the text, my family's thoughts are now reality. It's true that one person wants to outdo the next. Do they wish to go down in history for something that will never be forgotten? How awful is that one person wishes to one-up another person is such a terrible or unthinkable act of violence. Yeah, this idea of one-upmanship. And there was a study done fairly recently, within the past 10 years, I believe, that said most people would rather be famous for something, be it positive or negative, than just not to be known at all. And I don't know if there's any change in that from previous attitudes or not, but it's kind of an interesting thought. And then, of course, asking the question, are we just trying to one up? Because you're referring to 9/11 and then how there were terrorists and British who felt they needed to one up that. This constant cycle of pushing things. And I think that's, I think to some degree a common sort of element in humanity of trying to one up and do better. And the question is, do we do this in a positive, constructive way or in a negative, destructive way? And there seems to be a lot of negative, destructive ways at this point in time. And, that you also go on here, you start talking about media. You say, on the flip side, John Hartfeld portrayed many images from the 1930s that show Hitler's character and intentions were far from secret. Many people of this time said they didn't know what was happening in Europe during this time. But was that true? And that's right there a very important question, because Hartfeld seems to tell us something different, doesn't he? Were people just looking past it because they didn't want to believe it? Do people choose to believe the wrong information? And, probably yes to all of those things. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it, as the saying. And then we have to look in the mirror. Are we, in a sense, doing that now? You go on to say, I believe that there is very little on social media and visual culture that portrays the good or the truth. The media has so much power in our country. This brings me to question, is this power used by media positive or negative? And I think that's ultimately the real question. I don't know that there's any real difference. I mean, we've gone through these cycles before. We've had, violence. We've had dictators. We've had fascism rise in Europe and create all sort of chaos. And we're seeing right now a rise in fascist attitudes in our culture. And, who's responsible for that? Is it media? Is it social media? I kind of don't think so, but I think social media does sort of up the ante a little bit, where it's quicker, easier to consume and find and share that sort of attitude and information. What's the solution? I mean, do we clamp down on media? Do we, stop our free speech? Those are good questions. Questions I had is, as we're looking at this, if media is part of the problem, which I think it obviously is how it's being used, why is media trying to manipulate us? For what end? Who controls the media we use and consume? And can that inform us? And the thing with social media is, there's an empowerment to some degree with democracy and citizenry, because we can be our own media. But at the same time, I think that's in another person's research. Maybe we'll talk about that, where those social media can decide what gets pushed up and what we see more of. And, that can negatively affect us if we don't get a broader view or broader understanding of what's going on in our world. But if we look, at John Hartfeld's image, this is my favorite poster from him, because looking at this, we paint Hitler as the #1 bad guy in like the 20th century, pretty much. There might be people who have killed more, but we push him up as the sort of #1 bad guy. But this poster really tells me something different about that. These posters were fairly widely disseminated in Germany, and Hartfeld did eventually have to flee Germany because he did not agree with the regime and kept doing things like this. And of course, he became a marked man, and eventually he had to leave. But this poster tells me that there's a bigger power, and power supporting Hitler and pushing his agenda, and that wanted his agenda pushed. For what means? For what reason? And the research here is that it was the industrialist, it was the wealthy class that was using Hitler for their own needs, for their own gain. And that has to go back to, we need to look at ourselves in today and looking at culture. Who owns this media? Who controls the media and what we consume? And can that help inform us, like Hartfeld was trying to inform German citizenry? What is our responsibility? Germany, a lot of people look the other way. Anyways, so those are some thoughts. I think overall you did a good job with those posters there. We'll move along and look at the next person. We're going to look at Jeremy's posters. I'm going to turn my brightness up a little bit just to see this. So, you are not alone, and the image, I think, has a starkness to that and certainly speaks about that. And the text, I think, seems to have this nice sort of positive message, and I like how it angles up here. But in the end, I don't know. I can't decide if it's just too simple. You talked about using filters and stuff to exaggerate, maybe the little graininess. I don't know if I can make this a little bit bigger. I guess I can zoom in on it. Yeah, I can see some of that graininess if I do that. But I almost feel like it needs a little bit more dressing up, and I don't want more stuff in there because I like the simplicity and the structure of it. But maybe it might be as just simple as like maybe having this word just pyramid a little bit. So this is a little bit bigger and smaller, a little bit smaller, and then pointing more at it. Or maybe, I don't know if you thought about texture in the words or little drop shadows or something like that. Or I don't know if we need something on the edge. There's just almost too much black space for me. I can appreciate a simple design, but I just want a little bit more in this. Or maybe what would be interesting is in this black space, if we had like some dark gray textured text that could give me more information as to I don't know if you're dealing with mental illness or just plain loneliness or whatever it is. I think we could push this image a little bit or the content of this a little bit more if we give the viewer more. I don't want to disrupt the overall composition of it too much. I do want to give us, the viewer, a little bit more of a chance to mine more information out of the image in the end. And I think that, is, I think a similar criticism I have for this one as well. I do like how you play, certainly with the color and the symbolism of that. And then "You Are Not Allowed to Cry" certainly speaks of this manliness. It comes across, though, again, a little bit flat, just like I feel the previous one, a little bit flat. However, I really liked this, when you explored both those together. They seem to give me, the messages together give me more depth and more things to think about. And it's just too plain and too simple, too visually plain. And then the message itself is not very complex. Um, but when I put them together, now I've got, this oscillating, this tension between these two things. And, you are not allowed to cry. But as you read that, of course, you see this sort of drop shadow. But when you look at the drop shadow, and I like how you allow those drop shadows to increasingly fall away from the text so that they become more legible. U is just like a drop shadow here, but then we start to see R, and that happens progressively. I like that progressive element that you put in that movement. It makes it so much more dynamic. And then I look at You Are Not Alone, and then I take these things together. Now You Are Not Alone, and You're Not Allowed to Cry, and we've got this, male figure, backlit, and that to me, those messages visually together are so much more powerful than they were singularly, because I find these easy to kind of move along and like, okay, yep, got the message. It just like smacks me in the face a little bit and doesn't offer me much nuance. But together they seem to vibrate and interact more in a much more dynamic way. I liked how you talked about teaching a unit on propaganda and posters in your graphic design class, and that's a great subject. I was looking at reading, Morgan's. Is it Morgan's? I'm trying to throw, or is it Ryan's? Somebody was saying that they were not allowed to teach. Or political issues, blah 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 blah. They're made clear that they're supposed to not, they're supposed to leave their, here it is, their public school, their own political views are to stay out of the classroom. And that becomes interesting, because when you deal with propaganda, inherently you're dealing with politics, and so much of art, if we get into it, if we get in the visual cultural aspects of it, we're going to end up in politics. Now it becomes interesting that leave your own politics out of it, and it's totally possible to teach that, but it could also be interpreted that if you have a political view, you can't speak about that political view, and that cuts out a whole bunch of different things. I'm glad to see that you're teaching propaganda in your graphic design class, and I think that's probably very interesting. And you say your students like it, they're really engaged, so they're really engaged in the cultural element of this art as much, if not more so, than necessarily the visual element of the art. And to me, that's really important, and because that's what art is about. It's about that meaning. Yeah, okay, and you also went on and you quoted Heidegger, and you said, it was not the ability to make pictures with greater and greater ease, but rather a need to render the experience of being in the world as a picture. Heidegger is getting pretty deep there, but looking at the idea that these pictures create, this is not new what we're doing on social media. It's not new that we create these personas. And our identity is always malleable and flexible, and we can present it to different ways, to different groups, at different times, in our behavior. So pulling out that quote was good. And then you go on to say that looking at Mirzoff, and he says 478 billion photographs taken in 2008, mostly by cell phones. What is the number now? It is 10 years later, and digital photography and cell phones capable of far more superior. Plus, with the prominence of social media, 3 times, 4 times more photographs. I mean, photography has been increasing in its use probably every year since it started. In 1890, when Kodak released film, which was new, and then you would take the pictures and send it to them to process. The number of photographs doubled with that had previously existed in those 50 years prior, doubled in 1 year. I think a similar sort of thing happened as digital. I think 2005 is the year that we give that digital fully took over for analog, and analog drops off precipitously, and digital grows much quicker than analog. And then, of course, so many more photographs. And, it's probably slowed down, and the growth has probably slowed down to some degree since that point. But growing, 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 growing. Yes. Um, the pervasiveness of photographs. And then you get in your message here, the way tough men are portrayed as insensitive or even superior in the media. And then you talk about your third version, which I overlap the two messages to explore the relationship further and see if the meaning yet changes once again. I don't know if the meaning changes, but my engagement changes. And maybe the meaning does change because now I'm considering the juxtaposition of these two ideals in the sense of males. And maybe that's something, like I think we get a pretty good sense of the male silhouette, but I don't know, maybe that's something that could be pushed a little bit further. That, it's a male issue. It's I think fairly visual overt as male, but I don't know. Maybe that could be clearer. Okay, anyways, so those are some of my thoughts for you, Jeremy. And we're going to move on and we're going to look at Ryan's posters. And I liked, when I saw this photograph in the first project, I really thought it was beautiful and encapsulated so many different elements of male, female relationships. And then I think, going for the equal pay for equal work idea certainly is effective. The image has such nice negative space. And then distilling it down, the simplicity here, equal pay for equal work, just boom, bold, simple. I like the yellow background and the blue, and I'm not sure if there's any symbolism in that in regards to it. It seems to harken back to the Rosie the Riveter poster. Maybe I should have looked that up. But if that's where the colors came from, it seemed to have the yellow background. Yeah, there you go. The yellow, the blue, and the red, the primary colors. And there it is all right there. So, playing with that image that's already culturally ingrained within us is a good choice. Equal pay equals socialism. And this, I think was an interesting idea. And I had to think about it. Is that socialistic? I guess, it probably is. And then it brings up the idea, is the concept equality socialistic? And that, maybe goes to the heart of many of our debates. It seems like post-Civil War, there was much emphasis, and in many ways the direction of our country changed to be about equality. And I live in the state of Nebraska that entered the Union in 1867, right after the Civil War, and the state motto is equality before the law, which is my favorite state motto that I've come across, because I love the idea that it puts morality ahead of the law and shows that laws are not always moral, and it leaves it up to us, the citizen, to decide if it's an immoral law, then we do not have to obey it, and we have a requirement as citizens to challenge it and to change it. So anyways, but all the other things I looked at this poster because your choice, like, it feels very World War II to me, as does this poster. And this, of course, is America, Rosie Riveter. And I look at this, here we have the sun, and I start thinking of Japanese, and I start thinking about the Japanese culture of that time, which was brutal, dictatorial, and probably masochistic. So I don't think they were socialism, so I find the symbology a little bit off in that sense as I look at it. Now, on the flip side, I like how the radiating rays, push to you, and so I like that visual structure, but the symbolism of that structure to me seems a bit off. Japanese culture at the time was not socialistic. It was heavily dictatorial. and there was no striving for equality. It was pretty much the emperor was a god, literally, and everyone else was, I mean, mass abuse. Talk about mass abuse on a social, national scale. If you read about Japanese culture of the time, there's some beauty in that culture, a lot of beauty in that culture, but there's also heavy undercurrents of abuse. So, that seems off to me. Equal pay. But then I like your message. I have to think about equal pay equals socialism. And we, many factors in our country work hard to make socialism a negative term, despite many aspects of socialism within this culture for a long time. So, but then we look at the Japanese element, and if we put dictators in charge, people get abused. And is that the direction that we're going? Capitalism is this sort of strong survive. We like to portray it as competition, but as we get more conglomerations, bigger and bigger entities that control our economy, I don't know that that's good. But if we look at your research, you take Mirzoff, and he says that he stated the digital photos altered the lens-based reality we're persisting calling photography. That's fun for me to think about. Over the past year, I wonder how much of the images and news people see on social media is reality. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in this critique when we were looking at Morgan's work. We create these realities. What you choose to put on the news is important. It's just like taking a photograph, I always tell my students what you include in that frame is as important as what you exclude from that frame, and what you exclude from that frame is as important as what you include in that frame. And it's just like media, what we choose to report on. And, if you go to different sites, if you go to Fox News, and you go to the Huffington Post, and you go to the Nation, and you look at those different things and see how they deal with the news of the day, there's vast discrepancies in what they push to the top. And that, becomes sort of interesting. And then you also go on to say, social media is actively undermining some of the social conditions that have historically made democratic nations possible. And you quote that from Hall in the article as why social media may not be so good for democracy. And that's an interesting concept to think about too, because the idea of the social media that people like is that it potentially empowers us, that we don't have to just consume what comes from the national media, but we can share what our lives are really like and what's really happening in our lives. And it could be this potential to connect us and unite us and help us understand the plight of each other. But it seems like that's not what it's doing right now, or at least that's what we're thinking it's not doing. It'd be interesting to see in a study if that is true. And why is that? Is it those little bubbles? Because you talked about these filters. Bubbles are constructed polarized groups on social media sites, and thus making us more of a divide in American culture, because they choose what we see and they want to keep us happy and keep us within their media range, so that we're on their platform, which generates more income for them. So they want us happy, so they just give us the news that makes us happy, or makes us angry in the way that we want to be angry, or whatever it is. So, and then you go on to say, and I talked about this earlier, as a public school teacher, I'm told that my own political views need to stay out of the classroom, but that doesn't stop students from trying to ask opinions. I talked a little bit about that earlier. And then you went on to say, I enjoyed our poster lesson this week. It allowed me to show both sides of a political story. And gosh, dealing with art, the perception of it, I would say, that vast majority is that it just makes pretty pictures. I don't think very few art movements are just about making pretty pictures. They are about politics. They are about culture. They are about people's world and their place within it and their understanding of it, and quite often trying to use it to create change, positive change, negative change, control, whatnot. I think it's not that you can't have a political opinion and you can't discuss that in your class, but it has to be an open discussion. As a university professor, I have a lot more leeway in there in my classroom. I can pretty much say what I want to some degree. But even at that, I always try to, I often talk about politics because they relate to images to me. I don't see a separating point there. So we often get in political discussions, but I try to leave room for other views to come to the surface. I want other views to come to the surface. That can be kind of messy. And then you've got to, control that dialogue something, and that's challenging. But man, if we can't deal with politics and what's going on with our world and our classroom, that's, really challenging. What is it that you are to teach? How are you to teach them to think if we can't take their current experiences and help them contextualize them and to teach them how to critically think about them, to creatively think about them? That's, I think, extremely important. And if we're not allowed to give those tools, what's the point? So, all right. Anyways, those are some of my thoughts there.